If you are planning to bite me, at least wait until I finish feeding you." Emily Carter sighed as she stared at the enormous black wolf sitting in the middle of her tiny woodland cottage, its golden eyes fixed on her with the unmistakable expression of someone deeply offended by canned stew. 3 hours earlier, she had been walking home through the pine forest with a basket of groceries balanced against her hip, thinking only about the coming rain and whether the roof would survive another storm. She never imagined she would return with a wolf that looked large enough to frighten every hunter for 50 miles. The animal had been lying beneath a fallen oak tree, soaked from the cold drizzle, covered with leaves, and glaring at the world as though every living creature had personally ruined its day. Emily had stopped several feet away, expecting it to growl or disappear into the woods, but it had only lifted its head long enough to look directly at her before letting out one slow, exhausted breath. Something about those tired eyes made her forget every warning she had ever heard about approaching wild animals. She slowly crouched, spoke in the calmest voice she could manage, and held out the last piece of fresh bread she had planned to eat for dinner. The wolf stared at the bread for several long seconds before turning its head away with surprising dignity, as though accepting charity would somehow damage its pride. Emily blinked in disbelief. "Seriously?" she muttered. "You are hungry enough to collapse in the rain, but you are still picky?" The wolf refused to answer, although its stomach answered for it with a quiet rumble that echoed through the silent forest. Emily could not help smiling. "That settles it. You are coming home with me whether you like the idea or not." Getting the giant animal back to the cottage proved far more difficult than making the decision. Emily borrowed an old wooden garden cart from a nearby abandoned shed, lined it with spare blankets, and patiently encouraged the stubborn wolf to climb inside. After several failed attempts and one long staring contest that neither of them seemed willing to lose, the wolf finally stepped into the cart with the slow, reluctant attitude of someone granting an enormous favor. Emily pulled the heavy load nearly half a mile through muddy trails, slipping more than once, but laughing every time she caught herself before falling completely. By the time the little cottage appeared between the trees, both of them were soaked from head to toe, equally exhausted, and equally unimpressed with each other. Inside, Emily lit a fire in the stone fireplace while the wolf wandered through every corner of the tiny house without asking permission. It inspected the shelves, sniffed the rocking chair, circled the woven rug twice, and finally settled directly beside the warm flames with a dramatic sigh that sounded suspiciously satisfied. Emily placed a bowl of stew nearby, expecting another stubborn refusal, but this time the wolf quietly began eating without looking at her. "There you go," she whispered with a gentle smile. "See? The world is not always trying to bother you." When dinner was finished, she spread an old quilt across the floor beside the fireplace, hoping her unexpected guest would rest there for the night. Instead, she returned from washing the dishes to discover the giant wolf stretched comfortably across her own bed, occupying nearly every inch of the mattress while pretending to be completely asleep. Emily folded her arms and stared in disbelief. "That is my bed," she said. One golden eye slowly opened, looked directly at her, then calmly closed again. Emily let out a quiet laugh that filled the little cottage. "You really are the grumpiest stray wolf I have ever met." She pulled another blanket from the closet, settled into the old rocking chair beside the fire, and watched the peaceful animal breathe as the storm faded outside. Neither of them realized that before another 3 sunrises had passed, an entire kingdom would arrive searching for the mysterious black wolf sleeping so comfortably in the smallest cottage in the forest. The next morning, Emily Carter woke with stiff shoulders after spending the entire night curled inside the old rocking chair, and for one hopeful second, she convinced herself that the enormous black wolf had wandered back into the forest before sunrise. Then she heard a slow yawn from the bedroom. She quietly pushed open the door and found the giant animal still stretched across her bed exactly as she had left it, one front paw hanging lazily over the edge while sunlight poured through the window and warmed its thick black fur. Emily folded her arms and smiled despite herself. "You know," she said, "most guests stay one night and then politely leave." One golden eye slowly opened before closing again with complete indifference. "That is not even a little convincing," Emily continued. "I know you heard me." The wolf answered by rolling onto its side and somehow claiming even more of the mattress. Emily laughed and shook her head. You are unbelievably stubborn. She prepared breakfast anyway, placing scrambled eggs, fresh bread, and a bowl of water near the fireplace. The wolf ignored everything until Emily finally sat down with her own plate. Only then did it quietly rise, walk across the room with surprising confidence, and begin eating as though waiting for permission had simply been another one of its mysterious rules. Emily watched with amusement. So you do have manners. They are just hidden very well. After breakfast, she opened the front door wide and pointed toward the towering pine trees. All right, she said gently. You look much healthier now. The forest is right there, and I am sure your real home is waiting. The wolf calmly walked outside. Emily smiled, believing the farewell had finally arrived. Instead, the giant animal stopped at the end of the little garden path, looked around the clearing for several moments, then turned and walked directly back into the cottage without the slightest hesitation. It settled beside the fireplace again with a satisfied sigh. Emily stared in disbelief before laughing so hard she nearly dropped the broom she had been carrying. You cannot just decide you live here. The wolf blinked once, looking entirely unconcerned by her opinion. The rest of the morning became an endless series of quiet surprises. Whenever Emily carried laundry to the clothesline, the wolf followed a few steps behind. When she gathered vegetables from her small garden, it sat nearby watching the surrounding woods with patient attention. While she collected firewood, the enormous animal casually picked up the heaviest fallen branch between its teeth and carried it back to the cottage as though it weighed almost nothing. Emily stopped walking and stared. Well, she admitted with a smile, that certainly saved me a trip. The wolf placed the branch beside the woodshed before pretending the helpful gesture had never happened. Later that afternoon, Emily walked into the nearby meadow to gather wildflowers for her kitchen table. A sudden breeze scattered her basket across the grass, sending colorful blossoms rolling down the gentle hill. Before she could chase them, the giant wolf quietly moved from flower to flower, nudging each stem back toward her with careful movements that seemed almost deliberate. Emily knelt beside the overflowing basket and looked at her unusual companion with growing curiosity. For someone who acts grumpy all day, she whispered softly, you keep doing very thoughtful things. The wolf looked away immediately, almost as though accepting a compliment made it uncomfortable. As evening settled over the forest, Emily finished preparing vegetable soup while the wolf rested beside the front porch watching the fading sunlight. The peaceful silence felt strangely familiar now, as if the cottage had always been meant for two lonely souls instead of one. Emily stepped outside carrying an extra blanket and gently draped it across the wolf's broad shoulders. You can stay one more night, she said with a warm smile. But tomorrow we are having another conversation about boundaries. The wolf glanced up at her, and for the very first time its stern expression softened into something that almost resembled quiet gratitude before it lowered its head beside her feet, choosing to remain close instead of returning to the comfortable bed waiting inside the cottage. By the third morning, Emily Carter could no longer pretend the giant black wolf was only passing through. Somehow the cottage had quietly adjusted itself around his presence, as though every empty corner had been waiting for him long before either of them knew it. She found herself placing an extra bowl on the table without thinking, gathering a larger bundle of firewood because she knew he liked resting near the fireplace after sunset, and speaking aloud simply because the silent companion always seemed to listen, even if he never answered. I hope you appreciate how spoiled you are becoming, she teased while kneading bread dough on the kitchen counter. The wolf lay beside the window with his eyes half closed, but one ear turned toward her voice. You have free meals, a warm bed whenever you decide to steal it, and apparently unlimited patience from your very confused hostess. The wolf slowly opened one eye before looking away with an expression that somehow managed to appear both innocent and completely unapologetic. Emily laughed. I thought so. After breakfast, she carried a basket into the forest to gather fresh herbs and mushrooms for supper. As expected, the giant wolf quietly stood and followed her without waiting for an invitation. They moved through the towering pines beneath gentle morning sunlight, surrounded by birdsong and the scent of cedar carried on the cool breeze. Emily had always enjoyed these peaceful walks alone, yet somehow they no longer felt lonely. Whenever she reached for herbs growing beneath thick bushes, the wolf remained several feet away, carefully watching the surrounding woods. When she climbed onto a fallen log to reach wild berries growing just beyond her fingertips, he calmly positioned himself beneath the branch until she safely climbed back down. "You worry too much," Emily said with a warm smile as she brushed leaves from her sleeves. The wolf simply looked at her as though believing someone had to. On their way home, they crossed a narrow wooden bridge spanning a shallow creek. Emily stepped onto the weathered boards before one loose plank shifted beneath her foot. She quickly regained her balance, but before she could take another step, the wolf gently moved in front of her, blocking the unstable section with his broad body. He waited until she carefully walked around him before crossing the bridge himself. Emily reached down and softly scratched behind one pointed ear. "Thank you," she whispered. The wolf closed his eyes for only a brief moment, almost enjoying the simple affection before remembering he preferred looking serious. That afternoon, Emily sat on the porch mending an old quilt while the wolf rested nearby with his head stretched across the warm wooden floor. Without realizing it, she began talking about her childhood, about losing her parents years earlier, and about how the quiet little cottage had become both her shelter and her entire world. "Most days I do not mind being alone," she admitted softly. "But sometimes I wish there were someone to share dinner with or laugh when the roof starts leaking again." The wolf slowly lifted his head and looked directly at her, his golden eyes calmer than she had ever seen them. Emily smiled gently. "At least I have you for now." The enormous animal stood, walked across the porch, and quietly rested his head against her shoulder. Emily froze in surprise before carefully wrapping one arm around his thick neck. Neither of them moved for several peaceful moments. Far beyond the forest, however, riders wearing the colors of the royal kingdom searched every village, mountain trail, and woodland road. Messengers carried the same urgent question from town to town, asking whether anyone had seen a giant black wolf traveling alone. No one realized the missing traveler they desperately sought was spending his third peaceful day beside a tiny cottage, listening to the steady heartbeat of the kind woman who had unknowingly given a weary king the first place that had truly felt like home. The fourth sunrise painted the forest with soft shades of gold as Emily Carter finished packing a small basket for the weekly trip to the nearby village. She tied a blue ribbon around her hair, picked up a list of supplies she needed for the cottage, then looked toward the giant black wolf waiting patiently beside the front door. "You are staying here today," she said with gentle confidence. "The villagers are already nervous enough without meeting a wolf your size." The enormous animal tilted his head, clearly unimpressed by the decision. Emily smiled and pointed toward the cottage. "No arguments. Guard the house while I am gone." After several long seconds, the wolf slowly sat down in the middle of the doorway with a dramatic sigh that sounded very much like reluctant obedience. Emily laughed before walking down the narrow forest trail toward the village. She never noticed the giant shadow that quietly appeared between the pine trees several minutes later. The wolf had waited exactly long enough for her to disappear before silently following at a careful distance. Every time Emily stopped to admire wildflowers or greet passing birds, he slipped behind thick trees without making a sound. By the time she reached the lively little marketplace, the wolf remained hidden just beyond the edge of town, watching with calm, patient eyes. Emily spent the morning visiting familiar neighbors, exchanging homemade bread for fresh vegetables, and chatting with the elderly shopkeeper who always saved the sweetest apples for her. She smiled warmly at everyone she met, completely unaware that a pair of frightened merchants had just discovered enormous paw prints leading toward the village. Their whispers quickly spread from one market stall to another. "There is a giant wolf in the forest," someone murmured. "Its tracks are larger than any bear." Emily heard the rumors, but paid little attention. "It is probably just another exaggerated hunting story," she said kindly while placing carrots into her basket. A few minutes later, a little girl accidentally dropped her favorite cloth rabbit into the dusty road. Before she could reach it, a gust of wind rolled the toy toward the edge of the forest. Hidden among the trees, the giant wolf quietly stepped forward, picked up the rabbit with remarkable care, and gently placed it at the little girl's feet before disappearing back into the shadows. The child blinked in surprise instead of fear. "He was nice," she whispered. Several adults hurried over, expecting danger, but they found only the untouched toy and a line of massive paw prints leading back into the woods. The story spread through the village before noon. Some people insisted the mysterious wolf was protecting travelers instead of hunting them. Others believed the forest itself had sent a guardian. Far beyond the marketplace, however, another group followed those same tracks with far greater purpose. More than 20 royal riders guided their horses through the northern woods, stopping whenever the captain climbed down to examine the ground. He rested one gloved hand beside a fresh paw print and quietly nodded. "These are his," he said with complete certainty. "He is close." The soldiers exchanged relieved smiles before continuing deeper into the forest. As the afternoon sun began to settle, Emily thanked the shopkeepers, filled her basket with the last of her supplies, and started the peaceful walk home. Waiting just outside the village, hidden behind towering pines exactly where she secretly expected to find him, the giant black wolf calmly stepped onto the trail beside her. Emily pretended to sigh in disappointment even as a smile appeared across her face. "I told you to stay home," she said. The wolf looked straight ahead with perfect innocence. Emily gently shook her head. "You really do whatever you want." Together they disappeared into the quiet forest, never realizing that only a few hundred yards behind them, the royal captain had just spotted the same unmistakable trail leading directly toward the little cottage. Emily Carter had barely finished putting away the vegetables from the village when the peaceful silence surrounding the little cottage was broken by the distant sound of horses moving through the forest. She paused beside the kitchen window, listening as the steady rhythm of hooves grew closer with every passing second. "That is unusual," she murmured, setting a basket of fresh apples onto the table. The giant black wolf, who had been resting comfortably beside the fireplace, immediately stood. His relaxed expression disappeared, replaced by the quiet alertness Emily had only seen a few times before. He walked calmly to the front door and stared into the trees without making a sound. Moments later, more than 20 royal riders emerged from the forest, their polished armor catching the afternoon sunlight as they guided their horses toward the small clearing. Emily stepped outside, confused but welcoming as always. "Good afternoon," she called politely. "Is someone lost?" The captain at the front of the group slowly climbed down from his horse, but instead of answering her question, his eyes immediately found the giant black wolf standing protectively beside the porch. For one long moment, complete silence settled over the clearing. Then, without a single command, every royal guard dropped to one knee. Their heads lowered with absolute respect, and the captain placed one hand across his heart before speaking in a steady voice filled with relief. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "we have finally found you." Emily blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood. She looked behind her, then toward the forest, wondering if another traveler had appeared without her noticing. There was no one else. The captain was speaking to the wolf. She slowly turned toward the enormous black animal, standing only a few feet away. The wolf met her eyes calmly before looking back at the kneeling soldiers, his posture changing in a way she had never seen before. Without moving an inch, he somehow carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his authority. Emily stared in complete disbelief. "Your Majesty?" she repeated quietly. "You cannot possibly mean." The captain nodded respectfully. "This is Adrian Hale, the Alpha King." Emily's thoughts seemed to stop all at once. She remembered pulling the muddy wolf home in a wooden garden cart. She remembered arguing with him about sleeping on her bed, laughing because he refused to leave the cottage, and gently scratching behind his ears after he helped her cross the old bridge. Heat rushed into her face as every memory returned at once. "Oh no," she whispered to herself. "I told the Alpha King he was spoiled." None of the soldiers laughed. Their expressions remained filled with admiration as they looked toward their ruler. The captain finally stood and spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, the council has protected the kingdom during your absence. But your people have searched every mountain, river, and forest. They have waited for your return." Emily quietly stepped back, expecting the wolf to leave immediately. Instead, Adrian remained exactly where he was. He glanced briefly toward Emily before taking one slow step until he stood beside her shoulder instead of walking toward the royal guards. The unexpected movement sent visible surprise through the entire company. The captain hesitated before speaking again. Your Majesty, the palace is ready. Adrian did not move. He simply remained beside the young woman who had offered him warmth without knowing his name. Emily looked at the silent wolf with growing confusion. You should go, she said gently. Your kingdom needs you. The giant black wolf turned toward her, his golden eyes calm and unwavering, then quietly sat beside her feet as though he had already made a decision that no one else had expected. Around the clearing, even the seasoned royal guards exchanged astonished glances, realizing their alpha king had no intention of leaving the tiny woodland cottage without the woman who had unknowingly become the safest place he had ever found. Emily Carter looked from the kneeling royal guards to the giant black wolf sitting quietly beside her feet, and the unbelievable truth still refused to settle inside her mind. She slowly lowered herself onto the front porch step, letting out a long breath as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened in only a few minutes. You mean to tell me, she said softly while looking at the wolf, that I argued with the Alpha King about stealing my bed? The captain lowered his eyes with respectful restraint. Yes, Miss Carter. Emily covered her face with one hand and gave a small embarrassed laugh. I also called him spoiled. Yes, Miss Carter. And I made him eat vegetable stew. The captain hesitated before allowing himself the faintest smile. I believe so. Emily shook her head in disbelief. This is going to bother me for the rest of my life. Beside her, the giant wolf gently leaned his shoulder against hers, almost as though he wanted to reassure her that none of those memories should be regretted. She looked into his familiar golden eyes and sighed. You could have warned me. The wolf simply blinked with complete innocence. The captain stepped forward carefully. Your Majesty, every member of the Royal Council is waiting for your return. Important matters cannot remain unanswered forever. Adrian quietly turned his attention toward the captain, but instead of walking to the waiting horses, he remained exactly where he was. The silence lasted long enough for every soldier to understand the answer before a single word was spoken. Emily finally stood and gently rested one hand against the wolf's neck. You should go, she whispered. Your people need their king much more than I need a stubborn house guest. The wolf looked directly into her eyes, but did not move. Emily smiled sadly. Please do not make this harder. The captain watched the exchange with growing understanding. During the years he had served the Alpha King, he had never seen Adrian choose comfort over responsibility, nor had he ever seen him stay beside someone with such quiet determination. It became painfully clear that something far greater than simple gratitude had taken root during those peaceful days inside the little cottage. Miss Carter, the captain said respectfully, our people have always believed that an Alpha King's instincts are never without reason. They guide him toward those he is destined to protect. Emily looked confused. I only gave him food and a warm place to sleep. Sometimes, the captain replied gently. That is the greatest gift anyone can receive. Emily glanced back at Adrian. I did not do anything extraordinary. The captain slowly shook his head. Everyone else saw a dangerous beast. You saw someone who needed kindness. Those words settled quietly inside her heart. She remembered the muddy afternoon beneath the fallen oak tree, the exhausted eyes that had met hers without fear, and the strange feeling that walking away had never truly been an option. None of those moments had felt heroic. They had simply felt right. Adrian slowly stepped closer until he stood beside her once again, his broad shoulder brushing gently against hers. Emily smiled as she reached up and absent-mindedly scratched behind one pointed ear, only realizing several seconds later that she was casually comforting the ruler of an entire kingdom in front of 24 royal guards. She immediately pulled her hand back in embarrassment. I am so sorry. For the first time since the soldiers had arrived, several of them struggled to hide amused smiles. Adrian, however, closed his eyes briefly, clearly enjoying the familiar gesture before opening them again. Even the captain could not help smiling now. I believe, Miss Carter, he said warmly, that His Majesty prefers being treated exactly as you have always treated him. Emily looked at the silent wolf and quietly laughed. Then I suppose you are still sleeping on the floor tonight. The giant wolf calmly walked past the perfectly prepared bed inside the cottage and settled beside the fireplace exactly where she had spread his old quilt on the very first night. Watching their Alpha King choose the simple blanket over every comfort awaiting him in the palace, The royal guards finally understood that they had not merely found their missing ruler. They had found the one place in the entire kingdom where his guarded heart had finally learned how to rest. The following morning, the royal guards remained camped quietly beyond the edge of the clearing, patiently waiting for an order that never came. Emily Carter prepared breakfast as she always did, setting 2 bowls on the wooden table before catching herself with an amused smile. "I suppose habits form quickly," she whispered. The giant black wolf lifted his head from beside the fireplace and calmly walked over to join her, accepting the simple meal with the same quiet dignity he always had. Nothing about him had changed after learning he was Adrian Hale, the Alpha King. He still waited until she sat down before eating. He still watched the birds through the kitchen window while she washed the dishes. He still followed her whenever she stepped outside to tend the little garden behind the cottage. Emily was the only one who had changed. Every ordinary moment now reminded her that she was speaking to the ruler of an entire kingdom. She caught herself hesitating before every sentence and apologizing for things that had never mattered before. As they repaired an old section of the wooden fence that afternoon, Emily accidentally handed him the wrong hammer. "I am sorry, Your Majesty," she said automatically before quickly correcting herself. I am sorry." The wolf paused and looked at her with quiet confusion. Emily sighed and leaned against the fence. "This is impossible. 3 days ago you were stealing my bed. Now every time I look at you, I remember you are a king." Adrian slowly walked closer until he rested his head gently against her shoulder, exactly as he had done before his identity had been revealed. Emily smiled despite herself and scratched behind one ear without thinking. The familiar gesture came naturally this time. "I suppose you are still the same stubborn wolf," she said softly. The warm afternoon passed peacefully until the royal captain approached the garden alone. He stopped several feet away and respectfully bowed first to Adrian before turning toward Emily. "Miss Carter, may I speak honestly?" Emily nodded. "Of course." The captain smiled kindly. Since becoming Alpha King, His Majesty has spent years carrying responsibilities that few people could understand. Every conversation revolved around politics, ceremonies, treaties, or expectations. During these past 3 days, for the first time in many years, I have watched him simply exist without needing to prove anything. Emily looked down at the basket of vegetables she had been gathering. "I only treated him like anyone else." "Exactly," the captain replied gently. "You never asked for his title. You never expected anything from him. You simply opened your door." Emily remained silent as his words settled in her heart. The captain continued, "There are old stories among our people. They say an alpha may command armies, but only one person can become the place where his heart finally comes home." Emily looked toward Adrian, who had quietly finished repairing the broken fence before calmly carrying the heavy toolbox back toward the porch without anyone asking. He did not look like a ruler searching for admiration. He looked like someone who genuinely wanted to help. The captain smiled knowingly before stepping aside. At that moment, the giant wolf stopped halfway across the yard. A gentle silver light slowly surrounded his enormous frame, and Emily instinctively took one step backward in surprise. The powerful wolf gradually disappeared, replaced by a tall man with dark hair, calm golden eyes, and the same peaceful expression she had come to know so well. Adrian Hale stood before her wearing simple clothes instead of royal robes, looking far less like a distant king than the quiet companion who had shared her little cottage. Emily stared speechlessly for several moments before laughing softly. "I cannot believe I have been arguing with someone who looks like that." Adrian smiled for the first time without hiding behind a wolf's silence. His voice was warm and steady as he looked only at her. "Emily Carter, before these 3 days, I belonged only to the kingdom. Now my heart belongs somewhere else." Every royal guard in the clearing quietly lowered his head as Adrian reached for Emily's hand and spoke the words no one had expected. "You are the one I choose, and from this day forward, everyone will know that you are mine." Emily Carter stood frozen as Adrian Hale gently held her hand, his calm declaration lingering in the quiet air long after the last word had been spoken. Around them, the royal guards remained respectfully silent, giving the moment the dignity it deserved. Emily looked into the familiar golden eyes that had watched her gather herbs, repair fences, laugh over burnt bread, and complain about muddy paw prints, and somehow those eyes still felt far more familiar than the title of Alpha King ever could. She slowly shook her head with a nervous smile. You cannot simply say something like that in front of everyone. Adrian's expression softened. I have spent years speaking only when duty required it. Today I finally spoke because my heart required it. Emily lowered her gaze, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks. I am only a woman who lives alone in a little cottage. Adrian gently lifted her hand. You are the woman who offered kindness before you knew my name. That is far greater than any title. Early the next morning, the royal company prepared to return to the capital. Emily stood outside the cottage looking at the waiting horses with mixed emotions. The peaceful life she had known only a few days earlier suddenly felt very far away. Adrian approached her wearing simple traveling clothes beneath a royal cloak that rested across his shoulders. Even dressed as a king, he somehow looked exactly like the quiet companion who had insisted on stealing her bed. Will you come with me? He asked. Emily hesitated before answering. Your palace is filled with nobles, advisors, and traditions. I belong in a place where people worry about leaking roofs and vegetable gardens. Adrian smiled gently. Then let them meet the woman who taught their king that happiness could exist inside a small cottage. The journey to the capital took the rest of the day. Villages along the road erupted with celebration as news spread that the Alpha King had returned safely. Families gathered beside the roads waving happily. Children ran after the horses laughing, and every smile Adrian offered carried a warmth that had not been there before. More than once the captain quietly noticed that the king always glanced toward Emily before greeting the crowds, as though sharing every joyful moment with her made it more meaningful. When the palace finally appeared beyond the hills, Emily stopped in amazement. Towering white stone walls reflected the afternoon sunlight, while elegant gardens stretched across acres of carefully tended land. It was more magnificent than anything she had ever imagined. Yet she instinctively reached for the small cloth bag she had carried from the cottage, suddenly feeling very ordinary. Adrian noticed immediately. Do not be afraid, he said quietly. Nothing about this place will ever matter more to me than the kindness you showed beneath those pine trees. As they entered the grand courtyard, rows of nobles and royal officials waited in perfect order. Curious whispers spread through the gathering as everyone noticed the young woman walking beside the Alpha King. Some expected Adrian to distance himself once he stood before the court. Instead, he calmly offered Emily his arm and walked beside her without hesitation through the center of the palace. He stopped before the assembled nobles and looked across the silent crowd with the steady confidence of a ruler who had already made his decision. Many of you searched for your king, Adrian said in a clear voice. The woman beside me found only a lonely traveler and welcomed him without asking for anything in return. She judged neither appearance nor status. She saw only someone who needed compassion. If you honor me as your king, then you will honor the woman whose kindness reminded me what true strength looks like. The courtyard remained completely silent before one elderly advisor slowly bowed his head. Then another followed. Within moments, every noble and every royal official respectfully lowered themselves before Emily, not because of her position, but because the Alpha King had shown them that genuine worth had nothing to do with birth, wealth, or titles. And Emily realized that the greatest change taking place inside the palace was not that a cottage girl had entered a royal court, but that an entire kingdom was beginning to see people through the same compassionate eyes that had once looked upon a grumpy stray wolf. The months that followed transformed both the palace and the little woodland cottage in ways no one could have predicted. Emily Carter never tried to become someone she was not. She still preferred simple dresses, still greeted every servant with genuine kindness, and still believed a shared meal around a wooden table mattered more than the grandest banquet. At first, many nobles quietly questioned whether a woman who had once lived alone in the forest truly belonged beside the Alpha King. Emily never answered their doubts with speeches or pride. Instead, she listened before speaking, remembered every person's name, thanked every worker she met, and treated the palace staff with the same warmth she had once shown a muddy stray wolf. One by one, the whispers disappeared. Respect replaced curiosity because kindness proved stronger than judgment. Adrian Hale ruled with renewed purpose, but those closest to him noticed something even more remarkable. The Alpha King smiled more often. The heavy silence that had once followed him through every royal meeting slowly disappeared. His decisions became wiser because he no longer carried every burden alone. Many evenings, after the last council meeting ended and the palace finally grew quiet, he would find Emily waiting beside a window overlooking the gardens with 2 cups of hot tea prepared exactly the way he liked it. They rarely needed many words. Sometimes they simply watched the stars appear above the kingdom they now protected together. Yet no matter how beautiful the palace became, Adrian never forgot the place where everything had changed. Several weeks after his return, he surprised Emily by asking her to travel with him back into the northern forest. When the familiar little cottage finally appeared between the towering pine trees, Emily smiled as though no time had passed at all. The flower boxes still rested beneath the windows, the old rocking chair remained on the porch, and the little stone chimney welcomed them with memories that no palace could replace. Adrian walked inside, looked around the tiny room where he had once stubbornly stolen her bed, and quietly laughed. "I believe I owe you an apology." Emily folded her arms with a playful smile. "For what exactly?" Adrian looked toward the old wooden bed. "For pretending I was asleep when you kept telling me to move." Emily laughed so warmly that the sound filled the cottage. "I knew you were pretending." Adrian smiled before gently taking her hand. "I hoped you would let me stay anyway." She looked into his familiar golden eyes and answered with complete honesty. "I think I decided to let you stay the moment you refused the piece of bread beneath that fallen tree." Together, they spent the day repairing the little cottage, planting fresh flowers beside the porch, and replacing the weathered fence they had once mended together. Before sunset, Adrian quietly hung a small wooden sign beside the front door. It read simply, "Home." Emily looked at him with gentle surprise. "The palace is your home too." Adrian slowly shook his head. "The palace is where I serve my people. This cottage is where I found myself again." Every season afterward, they returned to that peaceful clearing whenever royal duties allowed. The villagers often smiled when they saw the Alpha King carrying firewood instead of giving commands, while Emily laughed because he still insisted on helping with every chore despite being the ruler of the kingdom. Some evenings, after finishing supper, Adrian would quietly transform into the great black wolf once more and stretch comfortably across the same old rug beside the fireplace. Emily would smile, gently scratch behind one pointed ear, and say, "You are still the grumpiest stray wolf I have ever met." Adrian would answer with the familiar quiet rumble that had once echoed through the lonely cottage, and both of them would laugh because they remembered how impossible their story had seemed on that rainy afternoon. In the end, the kingdom celebrated Adrian Hale as a wise Alpha King, but those who truly knew him understood that his greatest victory had never been winning battles or wearing a crown. His greatest victory had begun the moment one compassionate young woman chose to open her door, offer a warm meal, and believe that even the grumpiest stranger deserved a place to call home.